She stepped off that train with one trunk and a marriage contract folded in her glove. And by winter she'd be running numbers a whole railroad company couldn't beat. Nobody on that platform had any idea what was about to happen. Her name was Josephine Reed. Everyone would come to call her Josie. She'd answered an advertisement from a Wyoming rancher who needed a wife who could cook for his crew. Practical, almost cold, if you think about it. But 3 weeks before that train pulled into the station, a railroad agent had leaned toward her at the Omaha depot and said something she never shook off. "Most folks look at a kitchen and see supper," he told her. "Smart folks look at the same kitchen and see a storefront." She laughed it off then. She wouldn't be laughing for long. The train carried her into a scattered little town called Cedar Hollow. Key buildings getting shoved around by wind that never seemed to rest. Waiting on the platform was the man she'd married through nothing but letters. Thomas Whitfield. Big shoulders, sun-beaten face. The kind of quiet that isn't shy, it's just worn down. He didn't smile. On the 2-hour ride to the ranch, he said maybe a dozen words, and half of those were about the weather. She used the silence to watch everything instead. The thin cattle, the sagging barn roof, the dust sitting over the whole property like a warning nobody had bothered to read. The ranch house was bigger than she expected and emptier than she feared. A long table, scarred from years of rough men and tin plates. A kitchen coated in soot, dishes that didn't match, and the unmistakable smell of a place that had been surviving, not cooking. 12 hands to feed, Thomas told her. Beans mostly. Salt pork when there was pork. His first wife had died 2 winters back. The men had been cooking for themselves since. Poorly. She told him she'd gathered that from the smell. That night she met the crew. Rough, tired men who looked at her the way you'd look at weather you can't control. One of them, a mouthy hand named Boone, she cracked a joke loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "A bride with a frying pan," he said. Thomas had finally found a new way to ruin the beans. The men laughed. Thomas said nothing. Josie said nothing either. But she wasn't done for the night. By candlelight, she pulled a ledger out from under a stack of unpaid bills, and what she found in those numbers was worse than any joke thrown at her that evening. This ranch wasn't struggling. It was 3 seasons from going under completely. Flour bought in bulk, 1/3 of it lost to mice. Coffee that always arrived stale because nobody negotiated the freight. Cattle sold that should have been kept. And cattle kept that should have been sold. And then, at the bottom of one column, a note in Thomas's own rough handwriting. The railroad crews laying track 10 miles north had no cook. They were paying $1 a plate for hot food. Beside it, 3 words. Shouldn't too far to bother. 40 men, 3 meals a day, $1 a plate, sitting right there in his own handwriting, and nobody had touched it. She closed the ledger, and something in her locked into place. The next morning she didn't ask permission. She just made breakfast. Real biscuits, eggs fried clean, coffee saved by roasting the stale beans a second time low and slow. The men ate in stunned silence. A young hand named Sam went back for thirds. Even Boone wiped his plate clean with a biscuit and said nothing, which from Boone was as good as a standing ovation. Thomas lingered after the others rode out. He said it was a good breakfast. She said it was an ordinary breakfast made with attention. And then she told him she wanted to talk about the ledger. His face shut like a door. "Ranch business," he said. She reminded him that by the contract they'd both signed, it was her business too. She brought up his own note about the railroad camp. He called it a foolish idea from a low moment. Said he couldn't spare a hand for cooking schemes, and he wouldn't have his wife driving 10 miles alone to a camp full of strangers. It wasn't done. Plenty of things aren't done, she told him, until somebody does them. For 2 days she said nothing more. She just watched, shin the flour barrel, the freight bills. An older hand named Marv wincing every time. He pressed a hand to his back when he thought no one was looking. She watched Thomas ride out at dawn and come home a little more hunched each evening. Shin running numbers in his head that refused to come out right. On the third night she found him at the table, ledger open, face in his hands. The bank wanted payment by spring. His cattle were worth half what he owed. He had no way to close the gap. She sat across from him and asked to try the foolish idea. What was there left to lose? He laughed. Short, hollow, no humor in it at all. Nothing, he admitted. There was nothing left to lose. So she told him what she needed. The wagon on Thursday. Sam to drive while she cooked in the back. And she needed him to keep the men from laughing long enough to let her fail or succeed on her own terms. If it ruined them faster, then it ruined them faster, and he could tell the bank he let his wife try. He studied her like he was seeing a different woman wearing his wife's face. If she was going to gamble the ranch, he said finally, she should do it under his name. Sam became her first ally. On the ride north Thursday morning, he told her his mother used to cook at a boarding house before she got sick, and she always said there was no honest work beneath a person. She only work folks were too proud to be caught doing. He told Josie everyone around Cedar Hollow only thought about surviving the next season. She was the first person he'd ever heard talk like there was a future worth planning for. The grading camp came into view like an anthill somebody had kicked open. Tense tools. 40 exhausted men breaking ground for the rail line. She'd spent 2 days building a working kitchen in the back of that wagon. A sheet iron stove banked with coals. Kettles of stew wedged tight against the jolting road. Biscuits wrapped in cloth to hold the heat. Dried apple hand pies that filled the whole wagon with cinnamon. The foreman, a broad man named Voss, thick accent, permanent squint. Arms crossed before she even said a word. He asked why she'd driven 10 miles to sell them supper. She told him she hadn't driven 10 miles to sell supper. She'd driven 10 miles to sell them the best supper they'd had since they left home. The first plate was free. If his men didn't like it, she'd turn around and he'd have lost nothing. He ate that free plate standing up. Didn't say a word until he finished it. Then he turned and shouted across the camp. Food wagon, 2 bits a plate, company covers the rest, form a line, mind your manners. There's a lady cooking. The men came running. She ladled stew until her arm ached. Sam made change out of a cigar box. And in 90 minutes, every plate, every biscuit, every hand pie was gone. 3 men paid in advance for the next day before she could even nod. When the wagon rattled home that night, she counted the cigar box twice just to be sure. Even after covering her costs, she'd cleared more in one afternoon than the ranch kitchen usually spent in a week. Thomas was waiting on the porch. She set the box on the rail beside him. He counted it. His hands went still. He counted it again. All he managed to say was, "This is," and then he stopped. She told him Voss wanted her back tomorrow. Told him the company would even help cover the cost. Because fed men worked faster, and the railroad paid by the mile. The laughter the next morning had a different edge to it. Boone leaned on the fence and asked if the bride with the frying pan was off to feed the railroad now, turning into a peddler. What was next? Was she going to sell the boss's saddle off his horse? She told him only if the horse could spare it. Old Marv laughed at that one, surprising everybody, including himself. She went back the second day, the third day, the fourth. She learned the rhythm of the camp, which men wanted seconds. That the timekeeper had a weakness for anything with apples in it, and would pay double without blinking. She learned Voss's crew wasn't even the only one out there. 2 more camps down the line had no cook either. Every evening she added to the cigar box, and every evening Thomas counted it with less disbelief on his face than the night before. By the end of the first week, that box held more money than the ranch had seen since the last cattle sale. By the second, She'd stopped offering free plates entirely, because her reputation was arriving before her wagon did. Men from other camps walked extra miles on their own legs just to stand in her line. She wasn't the bride with the frying pan anymore. She was becoming something the plains didn't have a name for yet. By the third week, the whole operation had outgrown one wagon and one teenage driver. She laid it out for Thomas one night at the table. 3 camps. Roughly 120 men between them, and she could barely reach 40 before the food went cold. She was turning away money every single day. He leaned in now, instead of shutting it down, and asked what she needed. A second wagon, a second stove, more hands. So they built it. Thomas rigged a second stove into the old buckboard. Marv's back couldn't take a full day in the saddle anymore, but it could take a day standing at a camp stove. And it turned out he had a hidden gift for biscuits he'd kept buried under decades of gruffness. A widow from town named Adeline Lang, scraping by on laundry work, signed on to bake pies by the dozen, then by the crate. The ranch started to hum in a way it hadn't in years. Wagons ran on a schedule chalked onto a slate by the door. Josie negotiated directly with the railroad's own supply agent and bought flour, beef, and dried fruit by the freight load at prices that made her grin. Then turned around and sold hot meals right back to the railroad's own crews at a healthy markup. Buying from the railroad, selling to the railroad, pocketing the difference in between. One evening Thomas found her recalculating freight costs by lamplight and just stood in the doorway a while. His first wife, he said, had been a good, kind woman who kept a lovely home, and he'd loved her for it. But it had never once crossed his mind that a wife could be a partner in the business side of things too. He didn't even know that was something a person could ask for. The real turning point was payday. The first one in 2 years Thomas met in full, on time, with a small bonus on top. All pulled from a cigar box that had become a lockbox, that had become a real account at the bank in town. Boone counted his pay, stared at it a long moment, then pulled off his hat the way a man holds his hat when he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. He apologized for the frying pan comment, told her his sister was a widow with 3 young kids, a great cook, no way to feed them. Send her over, Josie said. Bring her own apron and her best recipes, she'd find her work. By morning, the whole bunkhouse knew the bride with the frying pan was hiring now. Then came the coach. Black, polished brass fittings. A man far too well, dressed for the middle of nowhere climbing out of it. His name was Prout, regional contracts manager for the railroad. He told her she'd been feeding 3 of his camps, doing it well by every account. And that was exactly the problem. She was operating on company land, selling to company men, without a company contract. He was there to offer a buyout, a small one. And to make it very clear, it wasn't really a choice. The number he named was an insult dressed up as generosity. She told him it was a fraction of what the operation cleared in a single month. He told her, flatly, that she'd been running on goodwill, and goodwill was something the company could take back whenever it wanted. One word from him, and every foreman on the line would be forbidden from buying a single plate. Her wagons would come back full every day until the whole thing rotted where it stood. He gave her 3 days to be sensible, then climbed back into his coach and left dust hanging in the air behind him. The squeeze started the very next morning. Voss rode out himself, hat in hand, miserable before he even got off his horse. Company men weren't allowed to buy from her wagons anymore. Effective immediately, he'd argued. His men had nearly rioted over it. But it was his job on the line if he let her through the gate. And he had his own kids to feed. He couldn't meet her eyes. Her stew had kept his crew going all spring, he said. And he wouldn't forget it. But he couldn't take a plate today. The other 2 camps shut their doors that same afternoon. In one day, Josie went from a growing operation to 2 loaded wagons, a kitchen full of pies going stale, and 5 people counting on wages that had nowhere left to come from. Thomas found her sitting on the wagon step, staring out toward the thin gray line the railroad cut across the horizon. Maybe they should take the offer, he said gently. It would clear part of the debt. They'd be no worse off than the day she'd stepped off that train. That was exactly the problem, she told him. They'd be right back where they started, 3 seasons from ruin. Taking the buyout didn't save them. It just made them lose slower. And she'd already told him once she didn't intend to lose slowly. He asked, without a trace of mockery, what her next move was. She reminded him Prout wasn't the only railroad on the map. Weeks earlier, buried in an old newspaper used to wrap pies, she'd read about a rival line racing to lay track through that same stretch of land, chasing the same federal contracts. Racing crews meant exhausted men working double shifts, and exhausted men, same as before, meant nobody had thought to feed them properly, because nobody ever thinks about the cook until the cook is gone. Thomas caught up fast. She was already pulling a fresh sheet of paper toward her. Prout only wanted her gone or owned, because her cooking made his crews faster. And faster crews won contracts. That was the real value, not the stew, the speed. So she'd go straight to his rival and hand them the exact advantage Prout was trying to choke off. But word travels fast on a rail line. Prout heard the wagons had turned south, and he sent a second offer. Sweeter this time. Doubled. With a clause attached that would have barred her from ever cooking for a railroad again as long as she lived. A man doesn't double his price and try to silence you, Thomas said, reading it over her shoulder. Unless he's scared of what you'll do with your mouth still open. The deadline was dawn the next morning. Josie spent that whole night writing the most important letter of her life. A proposal to the rival railroad's regional office, laying out in plain numbers exactly what she'd done for Prout's crews. She didn't beg. She didn't undersell herself. Sam rode through the dark to catch the southbound mail train. Adeline let her ovens go cold to save what food they could. Marv sharpened knives that didn't need sharpening because his hands needed something to hold. And somewhere in the bunkhouse, Boone's sister sang softly to her kids, the sound drifting through the yard like a thread, holding the whole anxious night together. By morning, when Prout's coach rolled up the road, brass catching the sunrise, Josie met him on the porch with her arms crossed and Thomas at her shoulder. She had no answer yet from the south. No telegram. No promise. Nothing but a letter on a train and a gamble bigger than anything the ranch had ever risked. He climbed down, already smiling, already certain of his win. The doubled offer stood until he stepped back into that coach. After that, it dropped to the original number, and the clause stayed. Had she finally come to her senses? She looked down the empty road where no rider had appeared. She looked at Thomas, who gave her the smallest nod. Your call, partner. No, she said. She wasn't signing. His smile curdled instantly. She'd just ruined herself. He told her. The original offer was withdrawn completely. She'd get nothing. Her food would spoil. Her wages would still come due. And he'd personally see to it that no company on that line ever did business with her again. Sentiment, he told her, climbing back into the coach, was a luxury for people who could afford it. She couldn't. Good day. The coach rolled off. The road stayed empty. The food was already starting to turn. The wages were still due. And the bank's deadline had suddenly shrunk down to weeks. Thomas sat beside her on the step. After his first wife died, he told her quietly he'd decided the safest thing a man could do was want nothing. Plant the beans, feed the men, survive winter. Want nothing, over and over for 2 years. Then she'd stepped off that train and made him want something again. A real future. He'd rather have wanted that and lost it than gone back to wanting nothing at all. He took her hand. They'd find a way, or they wouldn't, and they'd start over. But he didn't regret the wanting, not for 1 minute. Then, far to the south, she heard it. A horse running hard. Sam came flying over the rise at a full gallop, hatless, waving a yellow telegram over his head. Shouting words the wind tore apart before they reached the porch. He hauled the lathered horse to a stop in a spray of dust and nearly fell out of the saddle handing it to her. She read it once, her eyes blurring. Then she read it aloud, voice shaking. The rival railroad accepted the proposal. Full contract, 3 camps to start, growing as the line advanced, exclusive rights, double what Pruitt had ever paid per plate. The porch erupted. Marv whooped. Thomas laughed. Really laughed. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember. The road wasn't empty anymore. Monday morning, the rival railroad sent a woman, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Calloway, the company's regional provisioning agent, who shook Josie's hand like a business partner and got straight to work at the long table. She'd read the proposal 3 times, she said. She'd been asking her own head office for 2 years to take crew feeding seriously, because every line treated the cook as an afterthought, and every line lost the race because hungry men dig slow. Josie was the first person who'd ever put real numbers to that truth. They spent the whole morning building a contract that held up. Mrs. Calloway proposed 3 camps. Josie countered with a structure that could scale to 6 as the line pushed west. By noon, they had a signed deal, exclusive catering rights to the rival railroad's entire western operation, at a rate that made the early cigar box look like a child's piggy bank. Mrs. Calloway signed first and slid the paper across. Josie picked up the pen, then paused and handed it to Thomas instead. Both names, she said. It was a Whitfield operation. It always had been. He'd given her the kitchen to stand in. The news moved up and down the rail line faster than any train could carry it within 3 weeks. Word came down that Pruitt's bosses were asking pointed questions about why the rival crews were laying nearly a mile more track a week than his own, and why that shift had happened right when a certain food operation switched sides. By the end of summer, Pruitt had been quietly reassigned to a depot office out of state. He never came up that road again. The ranch transformed that summer in ways none of those 12 hands would have believed possible back when they were still cracking jokes about a bride and her frying pan. The bank debt was paid off in full by midsummer. Thomas rode into town and settled the note 6 weeks early. Coming home that evening with the receipt folded in his breast pocket like a love letter. They bought good breeding stock, mended the barn, dug a proper well. The kitchen, the same one with the mismatched dishes and the soot-stained stove, became exactly what that agent in Omaha had told her to see from the very beginning. Not a place where supper happened, a storefront, an engine, the beating heart of an enterprise. On a warm evening near the end of summer, the whole strange, expanded household crowded around that same long, scarred table. 12 hands, the cooks, the kids, the widows, all packed elbow to elbow over a meal so far removed from beans and salt pork it felt like a different life. Boone stood up with his cup raised. He'd once called her a bride with a frying pan, he said, and thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever said. Turned out she really did have a frying pan, and she'd beaten the railroad with it. Thomas stood too, raising his own cup, looking down the length of that crowded, laughing table at the woman who'd stepped off a train with 1 trunk and a single stubborn idea that a kitchen could be more than a kitchen. His wife, his partner, the best bargain he'd ever struck, even though he admitted he hadn't had the faintest idea what he was really bargaining for.